Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to welcome you to Addressing Equity through Universal Design for Learning. Today, our presenters are Sam Johnston from CAST, Luis Perez from CAST, and Amanda Bastoni from CAST as well. Again, just a little housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees will be in listen-only mode, and as we move through the webinar, if you have questions, you have two opportunities. You can either raise your hand and we will unmute you, or please feel free to post the question in the question pane and we will read those and address those questions as we go. Thank you so much. And with that, Sam, I'll hand the floor off to you.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks everyone and welcome. It's good to be here. I know these are difficult times for everyone, so we really appreciate you taking the time, and we will try throughout to make sure that our information is timely and relevant for now. And Luis and Amanda, my colleagues here, also from CAST, will be able to answer questions in the chat. There's some points in the webinar where we'll have specific prompts for you to think about things, but also if you have questions or need clarification as we move along, feel free to put in the chat or raise your hand. So thanks so much. We'll be talking today about how to address equity through Universal Design for Learning, and we look forward to your feedback both here and also in terms of following up afterwards. So just a little bit about yourself in the chat, if you can enter in more for everyone to know who's here, your role in your organization. Now there's a lot of us here, so that you know, I would say let's just do that for the first couple minutes, and you know, feel free to add something you'd like to know, but you can also do that throughout the hour. So the presenters today, I don't have a picture up here of Luis, but it's myself. I direct our post-secondary and workforce development efforts at CAST, Amanda Bastoni, who's a research scientist, and Luis Perez, who is our primary technical assistance specialist for the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, which we run at CAST. And we'll be here to answer questions now, but also to provide some support afterwards through our many resources and tools we have available at CAST. So who is CAST? CAST is a nonprofit organization. We work nationally. We work in K-12 and higher education, and actually also in the workforce. But our main ambition is really to bust the barriers to learning that millions of people experience every single day, whether they're in the classroom, whether they're learning in the community. Our goal is really to think about how can we understand our environments, understand barriers that might exist for various learners in there, and how can we go about learning them, lowering them. And we do this by helping educators and organizations really apply many decades of research and insights from the many fields of research into learning and teaching and practices in educational design and implementation. And Universal Design for Learning, our main topic today, which was pioneered at CAST, is really how we go about doing our work and really trying to design for everyone from the outset, as opposed to thinking about learner differences that naturally occur in every environment after the fact. So we try to help sort of systematically plan for and predict that there'll be differences and address that through design. So why do we need to think about this now, and how do we go about thinking about it? Many of you are probably moving to having to think about supporting your students through online learning. And what we need to think about in that context is really equity for courses at a distance. All students need equitable access to digital and print materials and technologies used to deliver instruction remotely. So both the content that's being delivered or the information and the technology that's being used, as well as the processes we use to engage students. How do we sort of build all of those into what we do now, moving into this different format? And we're going to need some thoughtful approaches so that all students are supported as learners within this new model for teaching and learning. And I'm sure some of you are quite familiar with this, some of you are less, some of you have done some and not others. So I urge you to sort of, you know, help one another out as we move ahead with good ideas and best practices. Higher education institutions and of course K-12 institutions both need to plan and often really respond very rapidly right now to a volatile and changing situation because of COVID-19. So just as context, my guess is some of you know this, but I think it's important to understand, who are learners and workers with disabilities and how many of our learners actually really require us, especially to be very thoughtful about how we design our learning environments. Now that extends well beyond learners with disabilities, but this is, it's important with learners with disabilities to think proactively about how to meet their needs, because often they're the least well served by one-size-fits-all approaches. 19% of undergraduate students reported having a disability. This was just from 2 years ago. Certain subpopulations are at an even greater rate there. So for example, 26% of undergraduate students who were veterans reported a disability. 23% of those who were 30 or over reported a disability. 21 to 24% of those who were independent, married or unmarried. That's the difference, as opposed to dependent. So certain populations of our students are really even more in need of us to really be thoughtful. There's also other populations, English language learners, students with less access to high-speed internet, or thoughtful approaches to technology. We won't be able to get to all of that today, but know that we're thinking about it and we're hoping to think about that with you. In the workforce, I think the really startling thing is that still only 35% of working age people with disabilities are actually employed. So the more we can do in our environments where we're preparing people for work, to really make sure that we're lowering the barriers to them to be able to fully engage in learning environments, the better off we will be at achieving our goal of making sure that people have equitable access to employment and to persistence and effective participation in the workforce. So what is universal design for learning? So universal design for learning was first officially defined in the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008. And it's really a term. Universal design for learning means a scientifically valid framework for practice that provides flexibility in the ways information is presented, in the ways students demonstrate knowledge and skills, and in the ways students are engaged. And it reduces barriers in instruction, provides appropriate accommodation supports, and really importantly, it maintains high achievement expectations for all students, including students with disabilities and students who are limited English proficient. So in short, it's really about trying to lower barriers through designing more thoughtfully and flexibly around how we present information, how we let students demonstrate their knowledge and skills, and how we think about their motivation to learn. We sort of take as a given that students are not going to all be the same, that they're actually going to be quite different one from the other, and we design for that. So today we'll really be talking about 3 layers of the UDL guidelines. The UDL guidelines are really based on ongoing research and practice. They started with about 800 peer-reviewed articles about best practices in education that were true to these 3 broad principles. One is really about providing multiple means of engagement. So we really know that the why of learning, why people participate in the first place, is really different from one person to the next. And because of that, we really need to think about how we provide more than one way for learners to engage in our learning environments. We always provide multiple means of representation, and what that means is that we really represent information in more than one way. We assume that no single format is going to effectively reach everybody, and for some people, certain formats are really impossible for them to access information or to really engage. And thirdly, we really provide multiple means of action and expression, knowing that the way we organize, the way we plan, the way we execute on a learning task is quite different for everybody. So we provide more than one way for people to act on information and to express what they know. So that's a way of looking at the 3 principles, of UDL and the guidelines. There's a way of looking at them. They sort of deepen over time. So, we grow our strategies around engagement. We grow our strategies around representation and action expression, but we also like to look at these horizontally. And what we think about as a first pass is really access. How do we create access to information through universal design, through the use of accessible educational materials and technologies? How do we really think about, can they even access the information? Then we start to build, and we really think about, okay, how do we support all learners to make learning meaningful, to build the learning skills, to make sure that they're comprehending the information, to make sure that they're able to engage with skill building and knowledge building and show what they know and get some feedback on that to know they're on the right track. But ultimately what we want is really this sort of, capacity to learn in whatever setting. So we call it sort of building independence. And we really think about how do we get people to sort of build the kind of behaviors that allow them to really learn over time, regardless of what's in front of them. How do we really help people become expert learners? So today we're going to look at the guidelines, just an example in each of those layers, starting with access. And we'll sort of, use this as the beginning way to sort of think about how you might frame some of your strategies, as many of you have to move to online or blended teaching, in the coming weeks and months. So we also wanted to point you throughout to a resource that we created. It's a free resource. It's really a website that we created at CAST a handful of years ago that's really geared towards online and blended teaching in higher education. It's called udloncampus.cast.org. And it provides strategies and resources around course design, around thinking about media and materials. So if you're thinking about using video in your class, how can you do that in a way that's beneficial for all learners? And thinking about accessibility and policies. So there are obviously laws around making information accessible so that all students can access them. We've got a resource in there that helps you understand what are your obligations around accessibility, what are the laws. So we'll be pointing to specific resources on udloncampus.cast.org today, but feel free to mine that resource and follow up with any questions as well related to that. But it's really geared towards helping you really practically, get right to things that might be helpful for you as you plan sort of courses and online delivery. So when we think about this first layer of really creating access, what are some of the things we need to think about? Really this first layer of can they even access the information at all? Can they perceive what you're trying to share with them? How do we provide more than one way to support perception, more than one way for someone to physically access environments, more than one way for someone to be interested, right? So right at the start, just thinking about, is this an environment they feel invited to, or is this an environment that they feel worried being a part of? Many of your students may have worries now moving to this format. It's been very abrupt. So how do we recruit their interest? How do we even think about that? That's what access is about. How do we really invite people in to the environment and make sure they're able to be at the table like everyone else, all students? So what is accessibility? So it's important to understand what that is. So this is how it's defined by the US Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And it says a person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, benefit from the same services as a student without a disability in an equally effective, equally integrated manner, and with substantially equivalent ease of use. So in short, what that means is that if I happen to be a student in a class with a visual impairment or a student with a hearing impairment, I'm able to get in and engage with the materials in the environment with the same ease of use, with the same quality of opportunity as somebody who may not have a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. So we have many, many resources at CAST to help you think about that. And we're going to just introduce a couple today, but know that there's follow-up support and resources so you can think about this as you move to online formats. Amanda, do you want to take this piece? Oh, sorry, let me do this and then one more. Sorry. So what can you do right now related to accessibility? So the first thing you could do is really find out what are your institution's policies and practices around accessibility and accommodations as courses move online. Contact the Disability Services Office, or maybe the Instructional Design Office or your IT office, and think about what are they doing? Are they responding? What's a partner institution doing? How are they responding? Once you know that, and you vetted what you can share out, think about sharing those policies and resources with your students through updating your syllabus if it's online, through communication you have. You may know something about your institution's policies and practices that your students may not, right? There's a lot of disruption right now. They may not be getting all the information that they need. So make sure that you're able to share what you know about how to support all students. And the next thing is really to inform yourself about where students can go to get some help if they need accommodations or if they need some additional supports as they move online, and then share that information with students kind of early and often. I think opening yourself up to, hey, I'm here to kind of be able to respond to needs. I'm not expecting that you all are going to go through this experience in the exact same way. Does an awful lot to invite students into this new format. Many students probably already take online courses, but you probably have some that haven't or have seen ones of variable quality. So really letting them know that you're informing yourself and you're trying to build your own as well as your students' best practices will go a long way to just having people feel like, oh, okay, someone's thinking about this and I'm not all on my own. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to just put out some questions for you all.
Can you hear me right now? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, first I wanted to welcome everyone. We've had some activity on our questions. I know Louise and I are responding to those. Folks at NAEP are responding, and also we've been sharing resources in the chat as well. So thanks everyone for participating. So this is another opportunity for you to respond, and if just wanted to remind everyone, if your question isn't answered immediately or during this conversation, we will be available via email and we can share answers with you. So how can you get help around accessibility? We'd like you now to think about this question in the chat. Can you share something you know or something you would like to know about how to address accessibility for your students in or like if or when courses move online? You can also share these via email or jot them down to share with others in your community once the webinar is over. And we have had some already. Folks are wondering about barriers and tips on using standard software to increase accessibility. I don't know, Louise, if you wanted to respond to that question.
I would need a little bit more information. What do you mean by standard software? So if you can put that into the chat, that would be great.
Perfect, great, yep. So add your questions there and we will get back to you. Back to you, Sam.
Yeah, so there are some, I will say there are, and we can put that resource in, but there are some uses of UDL in things like Canvas. So Eric Moore, for example, has put out, and maybe Luis or Amanda, you guys can put it, but a UDL on Canvas, very close to UDL on campus, but UDL on Canvas, self-guided course. So if you're using Canvas, I know Desire to Learn, many of you use Brightspace, has done an awful lot around UDL. There may be resources there. So if you're talking about standard software in terms of the learning management system your institution uses, it's probably worth even just Googling, Canvas and UDL, Brightspace and UDL, Blackboard and UDL. A lot of people have started to think about this well outside of CAST. So if that's what the question was related to, there is some good proactive thinking there. And many of those learning management systems, because they sell to the higher education market and they know the laws, have really built-in best practices around accessibility. So it would be good to sort of find out about those. Louise, could you put a VPAT, a link to sort of a VPAT table in, or
Sure.
understanding what that, I don't know if that's
We'll definitely do that. I would also recommend with Blackboard has a product called Blackboard Ally that can also provide supports around accessibility, and it also helps institutions kind of keep track of accessibility challenges that they're encountering, so that professional development can be more targeted. So I'll go ahead and post a few links in the chat related to Canvas and Blackboard and other learning management systems, as well as information about the VPAT.
That's great. And feel free to, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Sam. There are also some questions around UDL supports for English language learners as we think about moving online. So if you, Sam, or Louise, or have answers now, or we want to share some information now or later, I just wanted to alert you to that.
Yeah, so one thing also to look at in relation to the work around understanding your standard software is looking at what are some of the resources around translation in your learning management system. Some of the practices we'll talk about today hopefully help with some of the work of English, with English language learners, but I would look at some of those. And then we do have some resources at CAST, and maybe we can share a few. Some are books, but bringing UDL to English language learners as well.
Yeah, I'm going to share some books right now.
That's great. Great. Okay, well, please feel free to keep asking these questions. We're going to stop again in a little bit and we can keep going, but we did want to introduce you to a few sort of practices really to put you in the frame of mind of thinking about this. And this is really Louise's work, and I'm just taking a small piece of it, but the general guidance around accessibility follows something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. WCAG 2.0 is where we're at. We may, Louise, even be in 3.0. And that often is in a format that's pretty technical, can be a little bit hard to explain. Louise has created a great resource that we will share with you through our National Center on Accessible Educational Materials that will walk you through all of POUR. He likes to talk about pouring on the accessibility. But POUR really stands for perceivable. Can everyone perceive the information? Operable. Can everyone operate on the information? So if you imagine someone with limited physical mobility in their hand, and your only opportunity in a multiple choice test is to drag and drop, they can't participate unless there's a keyboarding option, or unless that environment operates well with maybe an assistive technology they use. So that's an example of operable. Can they operate in the environment? Can they move around and navigate? Understandable means can they make sense of the information? So things like understanding the language that's used. Some of you talked about English language learners. Are there terms that can be translated easily, or you can create a glossary that makes sure that the information is understandable? Can you make sure that they can access it on their device and it looks okay on their device? Say they don't necessarily have access to a desktop at home, but they have access to a phone. If that information is designed in a way to look good on a phone and a desktop, then they can understand it at home. But if half the information disappears when they're looking at it on their phone because it's not responsively designed, then it's not understandable.
Sorry,
Go
Sam.
ahead.
No, sorry, Sam. I don't know what just happened. I apologize for interrupting you.
No problem. And the fourth one is really robust. And robust really means that the information can work well with other systems. So if someone's an assistive technology user, for example, the systems talk to one another. They really sort of, one doesn't function one way and the other functions another way. So those are all really important principles. We're going to just take on a little bit of the P now, but know that you can take a short webinar that will walk you through all of POUR, so you can pour on the accessibility. So really an important question to ask as you move online is, can everyone see and hear the content? It's just a really important question. Ask it of your IT office as you're moving into these, as someone was saying, these standard systems. Can everyone see and hear the content when you think about choices you're making about media you might use in your class? How can you make sure that everyone can see and hear the content? So Two really important practices. You can include alternative text for visuals. We're not going to teach about that today, but we have lots of information on our National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, as well as UDL on campus. And you can provide captions and transcripts for videos. So that's what we're going to walk through today as an example of Perceivable. But no, there's a lot of other ways you can address Perceivable here, and you can get support through our resources. So if you think about one resource right here with captions and transcriptions, so on UDL on campus, we have a whole section called Media and Materials, and this is really meant to be like right now, what can you do if you're using video? Video can be a really powerful medium for conveying information. Get a lot of nonverbal information from video that can be really important, but it's not going to work for everyone. Someone maybe can't see the video, someone maybe cannot hear someone speaking in the video. So how do you make sure that videos work for everyone? So making sure that there's captions and often transcriptions. A transcript as well can make the content from video accessible to everyone. Transcripts can be especially powerful for English language learners. An English language learner could take a transcript and use it not in real time, right? They could then say, okay, I need to look up these terms to understand what that means in my native language, or I could put it into a translation engine and get it in my native language. So they're both really important. They're not redundant systems, but you want to try to sort of address that. So each of our resources in UDL on campus goes through a really quick, what is this? Why am I having to look at this? What are the UDL connections along those three principles that provide multiple means of engagement, provide multiple means of action expression, provide multiple means of representation, along with an example. And you'll see on the side, there's sort of a light gray. On the far right side, there's a call out box. That's just sort of quick things to get you right to accessibility resources. So how to create captions, for example. So that's one of many of our resources in media materials, but that's what we're going to talk about today if you think about video. So here's a video scenario. I'm a teacher, I'm a physics teacher. I'm going to use a video to share one of Newton's first law, the idea of friction. Now, many of you probably do this in your face-to-face classes. You use a lot of information that's nonverbal. You drop a brick down and we understand gravity, right? So the instructor video records a lecture and uploads it to the school's YouTube channel for students to use. That's what's happened in this idea to share Newton's first law. Imagine what this is like for a student who, when this video is posted with no captions, for a student to understand Newton's first law, who can't hear that professor or can't see this information and is not able to put a transcript into a screen reader for them. Not particularly informative, right? It just looks like a guy dropping a brick or throwing a brick up. You wouldn't even know what class it is. So the student turns on auto captions in YouTube. I wish they were better. They've gotten better, but auto captions still only get you to about 90% of accuracy. So, you know, this person watching this video is going to think that someone's arresting Romaine. So it sounds like a vegetable arrest as opposed to Newton's first law. Can be funny, but it's not funny for someone who's trying to understand the information. So what you want to do is you can sometimes start with auto captions in YouTube, and you can actually edit your own captions to improve them and make sure that they're 100% accurate, right? For a student who's deaf or hard of hearing, 90% is not enough for them to understand and really have fully equitable access to your course. So that's video with putting on auto captions is really a video with bad accessibility. You've done some accessibility, but it's still not good. And I think we were talking before, but it's the same with, you have a captioning function here in Google Slides, and it also gets you to only about 90%. So how do you make sure that students have 100% of the information, not just 90%? So when you think about captioning in YouTube, I bet your schools may have a YouTube channel. You can probably create your own as well if they don't. You have 3 ways of managing subtitles and closed captions. You can upload a file, so you could upload a transcript of all the information you want someone to have. You could transcribe yourself and auto sync, or you could create new subtitles or closed captions. And I've created a resource here of how to create captions in YouTube. So just using captioning takes a really wonderful medium for communication like video and makes it available for a whole range of learners that wouldn't have otherwise had access. Someone who's going through your lecture on the bus and doesn't have access to sound, someone who needs it because they're hearing impaired, someone who can't see all the information and uses a screen reader. There's a whole range of ways in which this information can help broaden out who has access to your information. In addition to sort of just captioning what's actually said, you also want to think about something called audio description. And audio descriptions gets added to videos post-production. And what it is it's basically a narrator that describes relevant details about what's going on screen that the narrator themselves may not be saying. So captions often capture the words they're saying. But for example, I'm here talking to you and I'm moving my hands a lot. Maybe that might be important information. So it can help set the scene and add the additional nonverbal information that might be important for your class. And there's a tool called NCAM Cadet, and it will allow you to create captions and audio descriptions, and it works seamlessly with YouTube and other things. And I put a link there to that. It's out of WGBH. So you can go and use that resource if you want to create your captioning and audio descriptions. So as I mentioned, the AEM Center has Designing for Accessibility with Poor. So that gets us past just Perceivable. Luis, how long is the Designing for Accessibility with Poor?
It really depends, but it's split into 4 sections. So there's a section for each of the principles. And then within each of those principles, we have links to a number of resources such as closed caption videos or tutorials that you can follow along with in order to upskill when it comes to specific accessibility practices. Like right now we're talking about captions, but we also have guidance on image description or alternative text, things like selecting different fonts. So there's lots of information there. So I encourage you to just kind of select one of these practices and spend some time, trying it out. And then once you feel comfortable with that, then move on to the next practice. Don't feel like you have to tackle it all at once because it can be a little bit overwhelming. But, one of my favorite sayings is from Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Something like that.
So there's also online modules on the AEM Center. So it's just aem.cast.org, and you can see it in the chat. But there's just resources, modules here on making everyday curriculum materials accessible to all learners. And as Luis said, take a little at a time, but even trying to build your skills and even doing something like using captioning does a lot to help your students in your environment understand that you're thinking about them here, and you're not thinking about them as all being the exact same. You're thinking about the fact that they all need an equitable experience in your learning environment, and that's not going to look the same for each student. So those are some resources to get you started. I want to look at the next area of UDL, this build layer, which is really about making learning meaningful. And we always say at CAST, our goal isn't to provide access to information. Our goal is to help turn accessible information into meaningful learning. So how do we sort of think about that next layer of supporting people to sustain their effort as learning gets more challenging, which it certainly is in the context of your courses, and especially as they move to a different format. And so that's more about, how do you build learning skills? And you are going to need to think about learning skills and how people sort of learn from you, but also learn from one another in these quickly changing environments. So there's some resources we have on UDL on campus. So for example, we have one on web conferencing and how to think about that from a UDL perspective. Many of you are going to be running webinars or web conferences. So that's, you think about online discussions that bring together maybe a smaller group of people, or you have a webinar and you put people into breakout rooms. How can you do those things in a way that help all people participate? You may have people with bandwidth issues. So you might say, okay, no one's going to use their video cameras here. What are some things you can do to make sure that everybody understands what's going on? So I think one of the first things is really be proactive and send out a statement asking if students require any accommodations to participate remotely, such as communication access real-time translation. So that's basically captioning software, or people who caption in real time. So if someone needs the information as captions, that's so they can read it as opposed to listen to it. That's how they can get it. Captioning also should always have its own dedicated chat window. You can imagine how horrible it would be for someone, and I've heard from people this happening, where the captioning is mixed in with the questions that are being asking, and they have no idea what the presenter's saying. So it always needs its own dedicated window. A speaker, if they can, should use her or his webcam and have really good lighting. It's very important that users can see them speaking. So for certain users who may lip read, or also just for engagement, being able to see someone speaking and know where they are and have, not a huge bright light in back so you look like you're, being beamed down from from the moon or something. So that's really important, to have good background and to make sure that the webcam's set up so someone can see your face. It's a really important practice to introduce yourself before you speak and have students do the same. So if you can imagine nobody's got their webcams and everybody's jumping in and saying things. I don't know if Louise said the last thing or who said the last thing. So in conversations, I would say, this is Sam and my point is blah, blah, blah. Having your students all do that really helps everybody know, okay, who said what and who's in the conversation. And that helps with captioners too, that they know, Sam said blah, blah, blah. And then I could follow up with so-and-so because I really like their point. And then pacing the delivery so that students have time to digest what you're saying. And that's really important, especially if you're asking them to pay attention to a lot of things at once. I'm not doing as good a job of that as I could. Actually, I'm going to admit right now, I'm not perfect here, but that's important, right? Because some students may be paying attention to captions and your slides and other things going on. So actually thinking about, maybe I don't need to cover as much content in this one session as I think. Maybe I can offload some of that content to another medium or another format. Providing options for communication is really important. So giving students choice in how they participate, chat, emailing, raising their hands. We're able to give 2 choices here, chat or raising your hand. That really can help. Sometimes different students show up as great learners online that were not learners that showed up in live, right? I've had lots of students who are English language learners that, ongoing asynchronous discussions that aren't in real time are great because they have time to plan and think before they have to sort of come up with an answer. So giving students choice in how to participate is really helpful for engaging all your students. Letting students know what the structure is for the web conference, what you're going to cover, and that it's part of other methods of communication for your course. So you might say, the web conference is something we're going to do. We're going to do it every week or every 2 weeks, but we're also going to have an asynchronous discussion board. And to get your grade, I expect you to respond 2 times a week. I expect you to, whatever your expectations are, but really thinking about that a bit and thinking about how to make that clear to your students, what, how their learning is going to be distributed across a range of settings and mediums. And then see if there are ways you can break up large groups into smaller groups. So you can use breakout rooms in many of your online systems. You can have asynchronous discussions with students kind of grouped in alphabetical order. So you can say that the A's to C's are going to be in this discussion group and the, D's to F's here, or you can have people join by birds of a feather. So, whoever wants to talk more about the epidemiology of this issue, go to this group. And so you can set up smaller threads in a discussion board to help you break people up into smaller groups. And then a really important thing is to enhance live delivery with other options. So where you can provide materials such as PowerPoints or other materials from the web conference ahead of time or at the same time. I gave you the Google Slides, right? You had those ahead of time too. And we checked on the accessibility of those. Louise helped me with reading order because I wasn't clear on that. So look for friends who can help you out too. Recording your web conference, sometimes that requires you to press a button. It's easy to forget, but it's important so students can go back and revisit. Things like creating a multimedia glossary of terms that you use in your course and posting it on the course site. Students are going to lose a lot of information they might otherwise get from friends, right? They're now all separated. Some people are self-isolating. Can you take your kind of key terms and create a glossary that has them not only written out as text, but an image or a video? Can you bring your students into helping you build that? This is a practice I've used for a long time that's helpful, but electing a few students each class to take notes and post those to the site, the course site. The reason that's helpful is because I might have missed something that someone else understood, and someone else may have understood some information in a different way that's really useful to me that I hadn't made sense of myself. It also can relieve students from having to take notes. So if students know that for every class of your 50 people, there's going to be 3 note takers, it's one less thing they have to concentrate on. Now you want to vet those and make sure the notes are, not totally inaccurate, but it's a really powerful way of helping students really get access to all the information if you can share and post those notes from a webinar or web conference after the fact. And you can create a back channel or use Slack so students can help one another. And that's very similar to the chat we're using here, right? People can have a side conversation and get just in time support. So those are some of the things. One other practice I wanted to raise, because I think it's really important to pay attention now about who's engaged and who's not, as students move on to this format. So there's a method called the Harkness method. It's used in a lot of K-12 schools, and there's something related to it called the Harkness map. So it's an approach that's really used to hold student discussions with the teacher acting much more as a facilitator than just delivering information. So I'm sure many of you break your courses into smaller groups and have discussions. How do you not lose that work now? How do you make sure that all students are included in conversations? Harkness maps sometimes also get called equity maps. But mapping is really used to show who's participating in the conversation. So I have here in this slide an example of a Harkness map. And what it is it shows all the different students sitting around a table. So you imagine a virtual table. It has their name beside them, and it has a bunch of lines from students to one another, and it lets you know who's talking to who's in the conversation, who's not, who's included, who's not. And in classes where they use this, they often make the maps available either in real time or afterwards to students, and it lets them see, hey, how good a job are we doing at really having a conversation with everyone and getting all the perspectives out here. And for you as a teacher, it can really let you know if someone's not included. And it can help you check in on a student. How are you doing, right? A lot of people are having a lot of disruption now. As many ways as you can to check in if people are okay. This is one more way. Are they able to participate in your online course or format? You could do something like this for a discussion board too, right? You could map who talked to who and make that available. One way that this gets done is with Harkness mapping. Online, you can do it. I just saw this from Microsoft Education site, but people using OneNote. So OneNote is part of your Microsoft suite, and I created my own here. It's really ugly, but it's fine. My intro to English class, week 12. And what I did is I just used the Microsoft OneNote draw tool. I created little blobs for every person, kind of in a circle. I then drew lines from different people, but you also can type underneath each name. So under Jessie, there's an I, under Maria, there's a QCI. All those things are tied to a key, and I created a key for marking students' contributions online. The key could be, reframed a question or responded with evidence from the text, or interrupted another student. So you can kind of create a key of what you're looking for, and maybe also what you're not looking for in conversation, and use that as the conversation's happening to know how students are participating, if they're participating in the ways you're hoping they would. So that's just one strategy for keeping track of the social dynamics in an online setting, used in a face-to-face setting. But it's a strategy for paying attention to what's going on, how are people interacting, how are they participating, who's not participating in this environment. So let's stop here. I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda. That's a lot of information at you, and hear about your strategies or thoughts.
Great, thank you, Sam. Again, this chat has been going really well. Louise has shared information about creating a Harkness map. So I just want to keep pointing everyone to the chat so you can see the resources. As Sam is speaking about them, we're populating that chat window, so please keep looking there. So we're really curious in the chat or in the question section if you could share with us some strategies you hope to use or plan to use when communicating with your students, especially in light of not being able to communicate with them face-to-face, but what are some strategies you're thinking about as we're moving online? And if you could share those in the question section or in the chat section, we can start discussing them.
And while we wait for that, I just want to share another quote that came through in the questions. Someone posted, "To be the teacher you want to be, you must first be the student you want to teach." So I wanted to share that. Thanks for putting that in the questions box. Someone is also just posted a suggestion of using the app Remind, which is a mobile-friendly app that you can use to communicate with families as well. So you can set up text messaging. So that's an important thing, is to keep in mind, keeping the communication flowing during difficult times like this. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, another one that came in from Shelley is she plans on having the PowerPoint lectures with audio, having them audio taped and posting them in advance, which I think is a wonderful idea as well. People are also responding to your idea of a note taker, Sam. So I think was a really great suggestion.
Great. Yeah, I've been in practice that I've used with classes of 80 people, and people have really loved it because it takes the cognitive load off of them of having to take the notes during the lecture or, pay attention to many things, and they know they can rely on their peers. And honestly, in this time, whatever you can do to support people to support one another. I've taught a lot of online and blended courses, and I always have found they're successful when peers are accountable to one another, just as much, if not more, than accountable to the teacher. And I always build in structures to have people accountable to one another. So, if people used to just submit their assignment to you, having them share it out with the class. We used to create a gallery when I was part of the Universal Design for Learning graduate course. We used to create a gallery of everyone's projects, and there would be 80 projects up as links. And everyone would learn from one another's projects. And the next year they get even better. And it was, there was so much good work that happened from really relying on the community of learners. And you're always going to need to be a guide. You're going to need to be quality control as a teacher. But there's so much to be done when they can take on, this is a moment for students to also step up. And you will find that, some of your students with disabilities are some of your best students at communicating online or using technology. So.
Sam, there are some questions about this idea of what if some students have access to technology. Earlier, there was a question about how a student wanted to use FaceTime, but the educator was concerned that other students wouldn't have that technology or wouldn't have an iPhone. I know that's a huge question, but do you have any thoughts about, how do we make sure everyone has the technology, or what do we do if some people don't? And Louise, also, if you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just say, we try to be sort of platform agnostic with the work that I do with the AEM Center, just to make sure that we are reaching, the broadest community possible. So we look for tools that will work not only on the desktop, but on mobile as well, and that will work across platforms. But the other thing is, beginning before your school closures start to take place, find out about your community. You can put out a survey that allows you to get information about what's available, what do people have that's available to them. And it goes beyond just whether they're connected or not. You can ask them about, is it reliable? Is it a connection that's reliable? Does it work during certain times of the day and maybe not so well during other times of the day? So just the more that you know about your students and the situation that they're facing, the better you can plan to reach them in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm. And I think definitely just adding, always having some strategies around low bandwidth. So, not everybody can upload videos. Can they all get the transcript? Can you think about their engagement if they can't get the video? A lot of the practices, another one we have resources on is around image descriptions. So if you were sort of having people communicate over Twitter, for example, and you had text equivalents to your images, somebody who couldn't download all that information can still get the text to know what's in a well-described image. So there's a lot that just by using best practices around accessibility actually can sometimes also support, okay, I can download this, but I don't want to use all my bytes or my dollars for downloading tons of content. So I'm going to put it in the low mode. I can just get the basic material and I still have the information. So
Sam,
there are definitely strategies. Yeah, go ahead.
We have had some folks who said that they want to encourage discussion and collaboration among the students, but just also pointing out that it's important for the teacher to check in frequently with the students via email or phone. And we've also had folks who want more, if you have more ideas on how we can encourage students to be accountable to one another. Those are some more comments that have come in.
Yeah, so I move a lot in online to really having students, I try to subgroup students in smaller groups. So if I'm running something and I have, 40 students, I try and create a subgroup. So some of you maybe have teaching assistants, some of you don't, but are there people who could be leaders in a smaller group where, maybe you went before and people just had presentations to you? Now, could you have them give presentations to one another that are facilitated or whatever, share assignments? That's one strategy. I think, budding people up, having a buddy system as you move to this new medium would be really powerful, just like in the swimming pool, when you're all watching your kids or whatever, and you say like, so-and-so, you're responsible for so-and-so. It's very different than saying, hey, I'll look out for one another. Creating a buddy system can really help. Those are a couple ideas. Having students sort of share strategies about, okay, how do we make this equitable? How do we address the fact that some of us are going to have faster communication than others? Getting students to take notes, things like that. Those all go a really long way to helping. I want to share one more strategy because I think it's one that relates to this question. So in this sort of, I don't really believe in independence. I'm a social learning expert. So I actually think that a lot of these sort of strategies of having good executive functioning and being a really self-regulated learner, and there's a lot of research around this, but they develop from having good models and different models. So seeing people get to a goal in different ways actually gives people a sense that, oh, there's, I can reasonably expect that I can get to that goal because I saw so-and-so do it this way and this person did it a different way, and I'm not exactly like either of them, but I have some of these qualities and some of that. So actually making clear to students what other students are doing. So this building independence layer. So this idea of self-regulation and executive functioning will be really important. We do have a resource in UDL on campus on supporting executive functioning in online learning environments. So I'd urge you to go look at that. But I did also want to give this strategy because I sort of love it. And I think this also helps students be accountable to one another, not only as performance, but as supporting one another. So how can you make problem solving visible? How can you make students, many of you have students problem solve in your face-to-face courses. How can you bring that online? So this idea of a stuck station is something that actually comes out of the makerspace movement, but is the kind of thing you could set up. So if your school has a YouTube channel, or even if you wanted as a low tech, like could you create a thread in your discussion board or on Slack or elsewhere where you're creating, where people actually describe their problem solving. So what problem am I having? What frustrations am I having? How did I troubleshoot? How did I solve the problem? And bringing one another into that. So the stuck stations have really taken off as an idea. And at the high tech end, they're really a video recording station where students can record, okay, here's the problem I was having, you know, I created a prototype, it really didn't work, I failed, I tried again, then I tried it this way and it worked out. Many students sharing their learning process of how they get to something can really encourage other students to, one, understand it's okay to not know everything, it's okay to be stuck, and hey, this is how this other person got unstuck. Can I try that out myself? So that's just a thought. You know, could you create in your online courses a place where people can share, here's the problem I'm having with this, you know, physics unit. Here's how I tried to work through the problem. It didn't work. And then I tried again. Are there ways of doing this? People do this on YouTube all the time. They teach one another all sorts of things by sharing their failures as well as their successes. So there's different ways of creating a platform or an environment to have students make their problem solving, both their problems and their solving, visible to one another. And I think that's, you know, you could have students post videos on a dedicated YouTube channel and make them caption. You'll see before, you could have them create a thread in your discussion board, or honestly, very low tech, have them mail stuff to you and you'll share it out at the beginning of a class. Say, I'm going to read 5 things that were sent to me over email that people weren't understanding, because I can guarantee if one person doesn't understand it, 4 other people don't. We're going to use that as our start point for, you know, reviewing our last lesson or whatever. So I think really important for students supporting one another is finding ways to make their thinking visible to one another in this time. So those are just some ideas. I think, you know, we just have, really, we're basically at time, but if you want to add in the chat and share some problem solving strategies, I can turn it back over to Amy and Kathleen. And just know that we are here with resources, especially udlonccampus.cas.org, the AEM Center, aem.cas.org, and cas.org. And we have a lot of social media channels you could subscribe to anywhere there. And we'll post on our website, but we're going to be trying to provide freely available resources to the community as we go. Today's just sort of a start, and it's a bit of a rush job. I apologize, but we did want to give you the framework. But I hope, you know, it's a start of being able to offer some support and share out some conversations. And I think Kathleen and Amy, you can make maybe the chat information available to the group afterwards so they can have all these great shared resources and questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Sam. We're actually not quite at time, so we do have
good.
So
let's open it up to
2:30. So if there are questions, go ahead and post those in the question pane, and Sam and Luis and Amanda will be able to address those for you. And all the great links that have been shared, I will compile for everyone and send that out with the recording of this webinar, so we have that information. But if you do have additional questions, I'd like to just give you a few seconds there. If there's anything, or Sam and, I'm sorry, or Amanda and Luis, if there's things on here that you want to share out from the questions that have been posted.
And I'll go back to the last one too. Also, you know, maybe a helpful one related to the question about how students can be accountable to one another.
Sam, also, folks have been asking about feedback. So how do we give really useful feedback to students, especially if we're working online or we're not seeing them as often? And maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, or anybody can. I mean, I think that we created, and we can put it up, a couple years ago. It was more for the middle school setting, but a bunch of sentence starters for mastery-oriented feedback and WISE feedback. So mastery-oriented feedback is really feedback that sort of is specific and supports people to move towards mastery of something. So it's actually not that helpful to say things like great job and good work. It's much more helpful to give people even critical feedback that's oriented towards what they need to do to address the gap between the level they've achieved and the level they've going to. The other thing we created were kind of WISE feedback sentence starters. So WISE feedback really has 3 components. It really starts by conveying high expectations for the person. So, I know that you're capable of mastering the content in this course. It then provides specific resources and details about how you expect someone to achieve that. And it's specific in terms of the sort of criteria to do things. So we have both mastery-oriented and WISE feedback sentence starters that we can share out. They can be used for written feedback, for feedback in a webinar or discussion, or in an email as well. But I also like to create situations where students give one another feedback, because that's also very, very powerful. And even being able to see one another's work is a form of feedback on your own work. Luis or Amanda or anyone else want to say anything more about feedback?
Yeah, you've talked a little bit about WISE feedback as well. So can you mention, just talk a little bit about that? Because I've also found that really valuable in the way that it reaffirms students and their abilities.
Yeah, so I think that also is really important. So WISE feedback really is especially effective for students who may be vulnerable to stereotypes about their abilities. So historically work with, female graduate students in math may be worried that they're especially if they value math class, that they're going to confirm a stereotype that, girls are bad at math. So doing things to provide the kinds of feedback that counteract those stereotypes are really important. So WISE feedback really starting with the idea of, I have high expectations of you, and I know that you can meet these high expectations, and I don't expect you to be exactly like everybody else in meeting them. Here's some strategies or some choices from getting from your goal to the outcome. So that's, I think, a really important thing to think about in terms of WISE feedback. And we can put some resources on there, including our resources we've created on WISE feedback. But it tends to especially have a real impact on students who would be concerned that otherwise they're, they would be worried about, you probably have some students right now who are like, oh, I'm a terrible online learner. Even saying to students, there's more than one way to be a good online learner. Some of you are going to be fine in these live virtual discussions, and that's going to work for you. Other students, that's not going to work for you. Here's how I expect you to show up in the asynchronous discussions. I'm going to grade your participation or look at you, evaluate you across all of these settings, because none of these settings are going to be perfect for all of you. I'm going to evaluate your work broadly. So those types of things can be very helpful. Reframing a task. So if you're giving a task or an assignment to students, starting with some WISE feedback and how you reframe it. I know that all of you are able to do good work here. I'm more interested in your effort than in, making sure you get this all right at the outset. So I think that things like reframing a task, or I should say framing a task from the outset, conveying high expectations for all students, but also choice and how to get to the answer can be really powerful. I don't know if others that are online want to say more or share more about strategies they've used for feedback and giving it online, or.
No, but I would like to say, Sam, that people really like your idea of the stuck station, getting a lot of good response around that. And do you think, Sam, how would you recommend folks, or would you use face-to-face, so like Zoom links or, other, as we talked about, FaceTime to communicate with students? Is that something that you think would be useful, or are you seeing folks use that now at this time?
I mean, I think if you can do it and use it, it's really helpful for people, especially for students that want to be able to see you or see one another. I really think the idea of a buddy system can be pretty powerful. There's a lot of evidence that for students, especially that feel marginalized in the, probably K-12 too, but in the college setting, to have a buddy or to have a group is really powerful. People may be losing that as they move online. How can you recreate that? So maybe, having both the idea of communicating with you, whether it's through Google Chat or, I would definitely try and have it either things that are available to everyone or things that are free. But I think having that option for sure is really powerful. But, when I've run online courses at the outset, I set up a system where, so say I'm running a 10-week online course, I very kindly pester people constantly at the outset. And I've run courses with very, very high retention. And what I do is I offer kindness and kindness and kindness and kindness for the first 6 weeks until people are really on board. Hey, I noticed you weren't on. What can I do to help? How can I be helpful? What can, are there issues about this medium that aren't working for you? Are you stuck in some way? What can I do? And I've had people who, the first 3 emails, they won't respond. And by the 4th one, they're like, yeah, here's what's happening. So I think that work of just being persistent, understanding you're throwing people into a totally different medium. Not everybody's going home to comfortable, situations or has comfortable situations. So how can you reach out and use the fact that you're, working with them now online to understand the level of disruption for them? And, it shouldn't all come from you. It's a huge burden for you as faculty to have to take all this on. How can you help them help one another?
Yeah, that's great, Tim. The relationship between emotion and learning is so critical, and I think it must be on all of our minds right now as well. That this is a very emotionally charged time for students. My 16-year-old son has gone through a range of emotions, feeling pretty insecure or nervous. Do you have any thoughts or resources for folks as they think about designing for online learning to include everyone, but also to think about how students might be impacted by this, crisis that's occurring?
Mm-hmm. I think there's lots. So you might put in the chat, there's something called a mood meter, comes out of the Yale Center for Emotion. They actually have an app, a mood meter app. It's not a bad idea to start your class with a mood meter and, see in real time where people are landing on that. We do have a resource on UDL on campus called Emotion and Learning. And then also it may be worth creating a, separate channel or a, email strategy or a chat room for your students that's focused on, okay, we're going to be offering support Monday to Thursday related to the content on the course. Friday, if you want to reach in and join this 1-hour chat, it's not really about the content of the course. It's just for you to let me know how you're doing. And I know, you have limitations and boundaries about who you are, what you are in the context of your relationship with students and, where you go, but, or identifying on your campus, just in the way you might identify who's providing support around accessibility, who's providing support, what's happening now in terms of the counseling supports, even letting students know, okay, guess what? Our counselors are all moving to Skype sessions and this is what's going to be available and they're going to make more available now than they had or whatever. So finding out about some of that.
The other thing, Sam, in a lot of my online courses, because I've taught a lot online, I always created 2 discussion boards. One was for technical support, and it wasn't one where it was just me answering questions that came up with the platform or with the tools that we were using, but other students could chip in and share their expertise, share tips, share ideas that they have picked up. And then the other one, I just call it social or something like that. Obviously, I put in some criteria, some guidelines for what could go into that social chat. But it's important as we move online that social component not be lost, because that also can support students during this difficult time. Even something as small as being able to just kind of vent and having someone, listen in quotes, even though they're just typing, can be really important for helping our students make it through this kind of disruption.
Definitely. And I think some of the guidance you might offer in, face-to-face classrooms is worth offering. So I shared the mapping and the key, where you can kind of create a key for what you see as a quality discussion. You can also sort of think about some of your etiquette for respectful discussion, or a discussion that, however you want it to be structured, and build a key around that and make that clear to students. Here's what we see as important, and it's okay to disagree, but these are the parameters, or these are whatever.
Yeah, and I was at the conference recently. We talked a lot about this growth, and we're all familiar with growth mindset and that idea, but really thinking about that online, especially as students, if your class has not been online in the past or recently, and now we're moving online, just really allowing for that growth and allowing for students to make mistakes, or making it possible for students to respond late or directly to you, or allowing them to share what their concerns are, I think is going to be really critical, especially if there's a big shift that's happening. Okay, yeah, it seems like let me see about some more questions.
There is a question here around, I believe it's section 508. It says, can you talk about what 508 is? So I'll just talk about that briefly, but again, the AEM Center has a number of resources. So section 508 of, it's our national accessibility law, if you will. It's meant to cover the federal government and its contractors, but because the federal government plays such a big role in our economy, it's sort of the de facto national accessibility law. And most recently, in the last few years, it's been updated to align to the international standard, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And really, all you need to know is those big principles that we talked about in this presentation, because those are the foundation of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I think that's a great place for educators to start, because Section 508 is more of a procurement law. So definitely being aware of it and making sure that people at your institutions know about it is important. But for you at this time, I think just getting started with those principles is a good first step. And again, we have lots of resources on our website that address 508 in more detail if you want to learn more about it.
Definitely. One other thing just related to emotion, and I'm thinking about this now as I have a full house, but it's okay to let people know that it's fine to be human. I have my 3 kids at home now. My husband just got home. I'm like, people, their work life or their school life and their personal life for, different students at different stages is gonna bleed into their learning or their working space right now in a way that it maybe hasn't before. Or I think just letting people know, that's okay. Like it's, we're not going to do this perfectly. We're going to try to do it as best we can. That can be helpful for people.
Sam, there's also a section question, I'm sorry, information about playful assessment. So slide 37, I was working my way back there.
Yeah, so the playful assessment stuff is that the Stuck Station comes out of there. That's all open source stuff. So what that means is you can adapt it, you can repurpose it, you can change it into something else, so long as you provide credit to Maker Ed and the MIT Playful Journey Lab, or the MIT Playful Assessment Lab. So that's where that stuck station idea comes out of. They have about 6 or 7 other ideas in there that you can look at, and they're all focused on how can we, in the context of learning, how can we more playfully, and not just playfully, but how can we capture some of the processes of learning and make sense of those, as opposed to just, you know, did the person get this right or wrong? So the stuck station is one of those things. They say, you know, the process of learning involves us being stuck and having to get unstuck and having to jump to the next level and having to wrestle with something and not get it right. And so they're trying to sort of bring that more visible into the assessment process as it happens and say, hey, you showed 4 ways that you were stuck. That's great. That's a measure of your learning. That's a measure of your effort. That is as important as whether or not you got the answer. And I'm not trying to downplay the importance of teaching people to build the skill and knowledge and get things right, but the goal there of the Playful Journey Lab is to support really building an assessment around the learning processes that we all use as we're struggling with learning ideas, and to make those more visible to individual students so they can self-reflect, to students and other students, and to teachers as well. So that's what the Playful Journey Lab does. And it's all open source stuff. The Beyond Rubrics Toolkit is what's linked to there. And that's where that stuck station idea comes out of, and you can reuse it however you want, so long as you give them credit.
Awesome, thanks, Sam. I'm just looking at other questions. So open educational resources, Sam, OERs, I know that's talked about on UDL on campus. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how that fits in with UDL and why it's important. I think that might be useful to folks, and I'll share the link also.
Yeah, the link on UDL on campus, and Luis, you might want to say more about, because you really know, I think, far more than I do about accessibility and OER. But open education resources are resources that are made freely available, so long as you give attribution. Luis, do you want to say a little bit more about OER and issues of kind of vetting them to make sure that they're designed well for all students?
Sure. So not only is following those great accessibility principles like POUR important, but one effort that we're working on at CAS is also the metadata, and that's something that often gets kind of overlooked as we design open educational resources. But part of the power of OER is that you can take these resources and remix them so that you can create a new sort of resource from other ideas and create maybe a different sequence or a different order for the materials. And so in order for you to be able to do that remixing, it's important to know what standards does the resource align to, what accessibility features does it support. And that's the part of it that we're working on at CAS, is how to create accessibility metadata that is user-friendly, so that an educator who's creating an OER knows how to tag it in a way that makes sense, so that then as a user or as a teacher or a user is looking for these resources, they can find the resources that match up with their needs. So do they need captions, for instance? They would be able to search for different resources that are tagged that have captioning in them, or resources that are screen reader friendly. What does that mean to be screen reader friendly, and how to tag those resources? It's important, but there is a lot of power in OER because it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can adapt things that have been developed for a more national audience. You can take some of that content and then adapt it so that it more closely meets the needs that you have locally. But again, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to not just accessibility, but also discoverability, so that people can actually find the things that they need to meet their curricular goals, but also their accessibility needs that they have and their students have.
And Luis, it might be worth putting, so I think it's BC campus, it's out of British Columbia, but they built a full area of fully accessible textbooks that are kind of like, you know, big high level, like, you know, widely taught, like Psychology 101 or whatever. And it's sort of an accessible OER textbook project. It's worth thinking about because you may have students who were using the textbook at the library because, you know, buying a $400 textbook for their physics class was out of their budget, and now need an OER alternative. So it is worth looking at, you know, are there open education textbooks that might be able to be provided for students to get the content that, you know, they were maybe, you know, getting from the library textbook as well. So
I'm gonna go ahead and post also some of the work that we're doing at CAST. We also host a center called CISL, the Center for Inclusive Software for Learning, and CISL has developed a tool called Clusive that really looks at you know, adaptability in learning materials and discoverability as well. And so there is a live demo that you can actually try. And so this may be a great way for students to try out different supports, different tools, so that they can discover their preferences that, you know, work the best for them. So I will post that information again. This is in development, but we welcome you all to contribute to it. Your feedback is always appreciated. This is something that's being co-designed essentially with the community. So we welcome you to check it out and provide feedback.
And we have a really old technology, but that people still love, and we're trying to update it, but it's a technology people still love called Book Builder. And maybe put that one in too, Luis, but it's a way of building your own fully, you know, accessible books with UDL built in. So Luis, you've worked on Book Builder recently, right? You might be able to say more about it and if it would be, but like people like, you know, this professor of disability policy, Tom Hare, used to offer all his materials. He used to just build his class out in Book Builder.
We're sort of taking we're taking the initial steps. Thanks, Amanda, for posting the link to Book Builder to rethink Book Builder. It still works on your computer. It's there are parts of it that rely on Flash, and so you may have an issue accessing it on a tablet, but that's the part that we're working on, is updating the technology. But what's really nice about Book Builder is that you can build, you can include some cognitive coaches within the books. So for instance, you can include a coach that addresses the vocabulary. You can build in a coach that has prompts for reading comprehension. So that's, to me, is one of the most powerful features of Book Builder, in addition to the fact that text-to-speech is included, that you can build a glossary. So you can include all these rich universal design for learning supports within the book. But the coaching by far is my favorite feature, because you can assign them to an avatar, and then they can perform a special function within the book to support learners as they're going through it.
And there's a bunch of already built books in there too.
Great. I just wanted to say one last thing. We would welcome any institutions that are interested at this time in researching with us on many topics, and or sharing if you have UDL initiatives at your institution. We are very interested in sharing those out so that other institutions can see what's happening around UDL. So I'm going to share a link to that site as well.
Excellent. At this time, we are getting close to time. Are there any final comments or questions or wrap-up statements we want to be sure we include?
People are asking if the recording will be available.
Yes, the recording will be available on Monday.
Perfect.
Great. And I just put the last page here, just resources. So we'll be sharing stuff through UDL on campus, through our AEM Center, through cast.org as we move ahead. And yeah, and we're happy to try and provide some resources and help as we go along. So hopefully this was a good start in terms of things. I know it probably feels like a lot all at once.
It was great information. Thank you so very much, Sam and Luis and Amanda, for being so flexible and having this webinar be applicable to the very strange world we're living in right now. I think everyone very much enjoyed it, as I'm seeing the thank yous pop up there. And to everyone on the webinar, thank you for taking time today to be part of the webinar. And we will be sharing out all these great resources and the recording. And do utilize CAST. They are really the experts when it comes to UDL and have been doing great work in this area and can be a great support during this very, as I said, strange time that we're living in. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.